As dawn broke on a quiet morning in 1937, aviator Bill Taylor prepared for what was supposed to be a routine flight. There was no storm warning, no emergency alerts, just an experienced pilot, a fueled aircraft, and a clear plan. And Bill Taylor vanished with no distress call, no wreckage, no confirmed answers. Nearly a century later, his disappearance remains one of aviation's quietest and most puzzling mysteries. Bill Taylor wasn't a celebrity pilot like Charles Lindbergh or Amelia Earhart. He didn't chase headlines or world records. He was a working aviator, dependable, skilled, and respected by those who flew with him. By the mid-1930s, aviation was still a relatively young and hazardous field. Planes were improving, but navigation relied on dead reckoning, basic instruments, and the pilot's judgment. Radio communication existed, but it was unreliable and limited, especially over remote terrain. Taylor knew these risks well. He had logged countless hours in the air and had a reputation for caution rather than bravado. That's what made what happened next so difficult to explain. On the day of his disappearance, Taylor took off on a planned route that should have posed no unusual danger. Weather reports showed no major disturbances. Visibility was expected to be good. Witnesses later confirmed seeing his aircraft depart normally. The engine sounded healthy. The climb was smooth. And then, nothing. He never arrived at his destination. When he failed to report in, concern slowly turned into alarm. Search efforts began within hours. The aircraft retraced its expected route. Ground teams scanned fields, forests, and waterways. Local residents were questioned. Days passed, then weeks. No wreckage was found. No fuel slick. No debris. It was as if Bill Taylor and his plane had simply been erased from the sky. To understand how this could happen, you have to understand aviation in 1937. Navigation tools were crude by modern standards. Pilots relied on compasses that could drift, maps that lacked detail, and estimates of speed and wind that were often wrong. A small error early in a flight could compound into a massive deviation later on. If Taylor encountered unexpected winds, especially headwinds or crosswinds, he could have been pushed far off course without realizing it. And once lost, options were limited. Fuel was another critical factor. Aircraft of that era had tight fuel margins. Pilots calculated just enough to reach their destination, with little room for error. If Taylor burned more fuel than expected due to wind, altitude changes, or navigation corrections, he may have faced a terrible decision: press on, or attempt an emergency landing somewhere unknown. If he chose the latter, it might explain the lack of radio communication. Emergency landings don't always give pilots time to call for help. Some have suggested mechanical failure. Engines in the 1930s were far less reliable than today. A sudden loss of power could force a pilot down almost instantly. If that happened over water or remote land, the chances of recovery were slim. And without modern tracking systems, there would be no final signal, no digital footprint, just silence. Others believe the weather played a hidden role. Even on days forecasted as clear, localized storms could form quickly. Low clouds, unexpected turbulence, or sudden fog could disorient a pilot within minutes. Without a visible horizon, spatial disorientation could occur, a deadly condition where pilots lose their sense of up and down. Many skilled aviators have been lost this way. Experience doesn't make you immune. What makes Bill Taylor's case especially haunting is not what we know, but what we don't. There were no eyewitnesses after takeoff, no confirmed last transmission, no physical evidence to study. Every theory ends the same way, with unanswered questions. As years passed, interest faded. There was no dramatic headline, no international search effort, no symbolic wreckage to recover. Bill Taylor became a footnote, another name in the long list of early aviators who took risks so others wouldn't have to. But his disappearance highlights something important. Early aviation wasn't just about bravery. It was about navigating uncertainty with limited knowledge and imperfect tools. Every flight was an experiment, every landing a small victory. Taylor's final flight reminds us how thin the margin was between routine and tragedy. Today, planes are tracked by satellites. Pilots have GPS, radar, real-time weather data, and constant communication. Disappearances like this are now incredibly rare. But in 1937, the sky was still largely unexplored territory, and sometimes it kept its secrets. Bill Taylor never returned home, but his story lives on, not as a legend, but as a reminder of the risks early aviators accepted so flight could become safe for the rest of us. And somewhere, perhaps beneath land or water still untouched, as time went on, Bill Taylor's disappearance quietly settled into the background of aviation history. But for those who looked closely, the mystery only deepened. Unlike many lost flights of the era, Taylor's route was not over a vast ocean or an uncharted wilderness. It was considered manageable, even safe, by 1930s standards. That detail alone has kept investigators, historians, and aviation enthusiasts returning to the case again and again. One unsettling possibility is that Taylor survived the initial incident. If he managed to land the aircraft intentionally or otherwise, he may have been injured, stranded, or isolated far from populated areas. In the 1930s, large regions were sparsely inhabited, with limited roads and no reliable communication infrastructure. A forced landing in such an area could easily go unnoticed. Even if Taylor survived the landing, survival afterward would have depended on chance, access to water, shelter, and the hope that someone would pass by. Many believe this scenario is unlikely, but not impossible. Another theory centers on navigational illusion. Early pilots often relied on landmarks such as rivers, railways, coastlines, and roads. From the air, especially at higher altitudes or in changing light, these features could look deceptively similar. A pilot believing he was following one landmark might actually be tracking another entirely. Over time, this could lead him hundreds of miles off course without realizing it. By the time fuel became critical, it may have been too late to recover. There is also the human factor, fatigue. Long flights in early aircraft were physically exhausting. Cockpits were noisy, unpressurized, and exposed to temperature changes. Pilots had to constantly adjust controls, monitor instruments, and calculate navigation manually. Even a brief lapse in attention could have serious consequences. If Taylor was tired or distracted, a minor issue could have escalated quickly into an unrecoverable situation. Some researchers have speculated about unreported weather anomalies. Weather forecasting in 1937 was limited and often inaccurate. Sudden downdrafts, wind shear, or unexpected turbulence could overwhelm a small aircraft. A strong downdraft, for example, could push a plane toward the ground faster than the engine could compensate. In mountainous or uneven terrain, that could result in a crash with little visible debris, especially if vegetation quickly reclaimed the site. Then there is the possibility of water. Even a shallow body of water can conceal an aircraft remarkably well. If Taylor went down in a lake, river, or coastal area, the plane may have sunk intact. Over decades, sediment could bury the wreckage completely. Many aircraft lost in the early 20th century have only been discovered by accident, sometimes nearly a century later during construction projects or environmental surveys. Despite all these theories, none have been conclusively proven. That lack of closure has a psychological weight of its own. Humans seek endings. We want causes, explanations, and timelines. The disappearance of Bill Taylor offers none of those comforts. It ends abruptly, mid-sentence, with silence. For Taylor's family and colleagues, the uncertainty was likely the hardest part. Without wreckage, there was no confirmation of death, only absence. No funeral with a body, no final resting place to visit. Just unanswered questions and the hope, however faint, that one day something might be found. Over the decades, aviation technology advanced rapidly, driven in part by tragedies like this. Better navigation systems were developed, radio communication improved, search and rescue protocols became standardized. Flight tracking, emergency beacons, and weather radar all emerged to reduce the likelihood of planes simply disappearing. In a way, Bill Taylor's final flight contributed indirectly to a safer future for aviation. Still, the mystery remains unresolved. Every so often, a researcher or hobbyist revisits the case, maps spread out, notes compared, theories re-examined. New technology has even allowed for satellite imagery analysis of remote regions, though nothing definitively linked to Taylor has surfaced. The passage of time, instead of closing the case, has only made it more elusive. There is something deeply symbolic about a pilot disappearing into the sky. Flight itself represents freedom, ambition, and humanity's desire to go beyond its limits. When a pilot vanishes, it feels as though the sky has claimed one of its own, without explanation, without warning. Bill Taylor's story is not one of fame or heroics. It is quieter, more human. It's the story of a professional doing his job, trusting his skills and his machine, and never coming back. That ordinariness is what makes it so haunting. If it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone flying in that era. Today, his name is rarely mentioned outside specialized circles. There are no monuments, no documentaries dedicated solely to him. Yet his disappearance remains a powerful reminder of how fragile early aviation was, and how much modern flight owes to those who flew before safety was guaranteed. Some mysteries shout, others whisper. Bill Taylor's disappearance whispers across time, carried by unanswered questions and empty skies. Until evidence emerges, and it may never, his final moments will remain unknowable. But his legacy lives on in every safe landing made possible by lessons learned from the past. And somewhere between the clouds and the ground, between history and speculation, Bill Taylor's last flight continues unfinished, unresolved, and quietly unforgettable.